May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A young woman in her early 20s, I'll call her Vanessa, enjoyed spending her summertime at the cabin in New Hampshire where their family vacationed year after year. One warm summer's eve, she took a walk with her father down the pathway into the woods that led away from the cabin. And during that walk that night, they argued about the usual stuff. Her boyfriend wasn't good enough. Her career plans were not ambitious enough. And the message that Vanessa heard was that she was not good enough. So this walk, she turned to her father and she said, "Dad, you are hard-hearted." And then she turned away and walked back toward the cabin. Her dad followed her. They walked in silence. He attempted to talk, but she was stubbornly quiet. And then Vanessa suddenly stubbed her toe on the trail, on a rock. And she looked down, and there, as if it were glaring at her, was a rock. And it was in the shape of a heart. I happen to have one that someone gave me once, a heart-shaped rock. Vanessa picked up the rock, and she wiped it off, and she handed it to her father. And he put it in his pocket. No words were spoken. Just a little shy of 2 years later, Vanessa married the not good enough guy. And they've been married now for about 43 years, so he turned out to be more than enough. But that isn't the moral of the story. It was on her wedding day that Vanessa and her father were standing in the narthex of the church just about to go in. He was going to walk her down the aisle when her father reached into his pocket and he pulled out the rock, the same stone that she had stumbled over. And he told her that he always carried it with him. It caused him to think about her, to consider love and relationships, and what was enough. So the rock was like an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, a sacramental thing. We learned that in confirmation. What is a sacrament? It's an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. A sacramental thing about the love between a father and her daughter, and his daughter. We all know about relationships that they can cause our hearts to burn within us with both anger and also to burn with love. Even those who aren't closest to us don't always understand how we have to live out our lives. And Vanessa was frustrated with her father, who wanted to protect her. He was a stumbling block to her moving forward and getting married to the man she loved. At the same time, she wanted her father's love and support as she stepped out beyond her birth family to risk getting married and then starting a family of her own. She had to live out her own life. So while that rock on the path was a stumbling block to Vanessa, it was also a symbol of the wrangling between two people, and that same rock became a sign of the love between Vanessa and her dad. The idea of a stumbling block is what I want to focus on in this sermon, in this story, and also in the gospel story, in the relationship between Jesus and Peter. I think of how Peter adored Jesus, and how Peter was the rock that Jesus declared he would build his church upon. These two men were extremely close, and yet Peter, in all of his humanity, was also a stumbling block to Jesus. When Jesus says he has to go to Jerusalem, I have to set my face toward that city and face death, and on the third day be raised. Peter objects. He says, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." And just as Vanessa's father did not want his daughter to be hurt by anyone, he wanted the best for her. Peter did not want Jesus to be hurt or harmed. But who are Peter's words for? Do they benefit Peter? He wants to protect the man he loves so that they can continue their deep spiritual friendship. But does he see that God is calling Jesus to something bigger, something beyond the relationship of the two of them? Meanwhile, Jesus knows he has to go through much suffering and the greatest sacrifice of his own life. But it will be for the greater good, to fulfill a divine destiny. He tries to explain to the disciples what has to happen. And then come the words of Peter. For Jesus, they get in the way of his mission as Messiah, as the anointed one, the one who came into the world that we might have love and redemption and have it more abundantly. And so when Jesus hears Peter's words forbidding him to go to Jerusalem and to the cross, it must have felt like an enticement almost for Jesus not to do the hard thing that he's called to do. And so Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." He's not condemning Peter, I don't think, but condemning the temptation that Jesus feels to avoid fulfilling his mission. It's so interesting to me that the same man Jesus had called to be the rock on whom he would build his church becomes the same source of temptation to Jesus in his mission to give his life for the world. Peter the rock becomes Peter the stone of stumbling. It's a jarring juxtaposition. Yet Peter is both rock and the stone of stumbling, isn't he? I think Peter continues to think the same way that all of us do. As good human beings, we're accustomed to thinking reasonably, egocentrically, and in terms of human friendship and success. But generally, we don't understand the sacrifice that Jesus made in order for us to obtain life without end. What Jesus shows us is that the cost of discipleship is high. If you want to be a disciple of Christ, he says, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Jesus wants to show us that there is a greater reality that we can attain, that there's a broader vision of compassion that we can access by the giving up of our own desires on behalf of others. Of course, we still have to care for ourselves. We have to have a self to give up. But we also have to put our own desires aside to live out God's mission. Now, Vanessa's dad came to understand that he had to let go of his precious daughter. As an adult, Vanessa could make her own choice about the person that she would share her life with. Another man would become just as important in her life as her father had been. And another person would protect her as her father had, and vice versa. So the father did give his daughter up, but he kept that rock as a sign of the love and the forgiveness between them on that wedding day and going forward. Now, during this time of the pandemic, many of us are wondering if our domestic relationships will survive this terrible coronavirus. The New York Times recently had a story about an uptick in more breakups, separations, and divorces. And now as COVID drags on, seemingly an endless period, The pressures are mounting up inside our homes. School is starting up. You know, I think a lot of us are fearful. Will the rates of infection increase again? The overall anxiety just adds up. So how, in these circumstances, do we handle the inevitable stumbling blocks in our relationships at home or at the office? I think if our energy is focused inward, it can become despairing. Loving one another requires putting others' needs before our own and asking, what would God have me do in this situation? What is the bigger mission afoot? So may we go out of here today thinking about loving more outwardly. We'll certainly stumble over rocks on the way, and we're on a very tough path right now. But trusting in God's help, we will navigate it. So I invite us to lean on the rock of our salvation, our God of goodness, and find that love demands more of us, more growth, more attempts at loving the world beyond ourselves. For Jesus Christ's sake, amen.